Well, thanks again for being here. I hope you enjoyed the lunch this year. And I just have one bone to pick with my wife today, even though it's our anniversary. I got a message. She does this every day when she does the Wordle. She sent me a message at 9:56 when we were having our program here, right, that she had completed the Wordle in 3 or whatever. But I think there were important things going on here in this room at that time, Laurie. So anyway, this is really an honor for me, again, to have with me Commissioners Brendan Carr and Nathan Symington. It's always special to hear their views. I think I called this session, I try to be imaginative, but probably failed again this year, but it's called Views from the Top.
Better than that. The alternate headline was Dumb and Dumber, but I'm glad we went with this one instead. It's better.
I wouldn't do that. I mean, I'm still a young man, but I've already learned not to do that. But I did learn something recently. I saw, and I just hadn't focused on this, in the new building that you're in, now you're on the 10th floor, right? I think I saw that you're on the 10th floor, and of course, I probably will never be able to, in my mind, get out of my mind that, you know, we're going to visit the 8th floor and you guys are on the 8th floor, but I guess all of you people out there will have to get used to it. Right.
Yeah, this is one of my many gripes with Chairman Pai, is the failure to carry the 8th floor over to the new building, but my list of gripes is long at this point.
Okay. Well, we did do a session earlier, what's been bugging me lately. But
missed it.
Maybe next time you can tell us about some of those. Okay, so this year I've been really better at adhering to the protocol that I said that I'm not going to recite these long biographies because they're in the program that everyone has. So I'll just say this really briefly about each one of you. Commissioner Carr was nominated to serve as a commissioner by President Trump and confirmed unanimously by the Senate in 2017. In 2019, he was nominated and confirmed to serve a new 5-year term, and he'll be able to tell you as we go along about all the good things he does over at the commission. I'm just going to point out he is a former general counsel of the FCC. So when I have a tough legal question, maybe I'll ask him first, and Nathan secondly. Nathan Symington was nominated to serve as a commissioner by former President Trump. He was confirmed in 2020, and before that, he served as a senior advisor at NTIA, and he is something that I've come to appreciate more and more as I've gotten to know Commissioner Symington better. Is you know, he has private sector experience that I think is really useful and important as he carries on his work at the commission in terms of some of the ways he looks at things that sometimes people that don't have the benefit of that experience don't. So I think, you know, that's important. So, you know, I remember when we were here last year doing this session, I remarked about how unusual it had been that for as long as it had been at that time that there was a 2-2 split at the commission. That was last May when we did this. I probably wouldn't have imagined that there still would be 2-2. And so, you know, I just want to ask you can give me an update because a lot of people, including myself, feel like when we look at the commission and what you've been doing, that you've accomplished a lot of important things. In the meantime, a lot of those things have been done on a unanimous basis, or otherwise they wouldn't necessarily get done. So maybe just tell us, because I'm looking from the outside, how things from your perspective have been working in this really unusual, fairly unusual situation for such an extended period of time. I think it's probably without precedent for this long. Tell us what you think, and I've even heard some people say that maybe the commission should just, maybe four members would be good, and have
at
two.
Least for the next 2 years. Yeah, no, that's true. That's true.
So why don't you give us any thoughts that you have, Brendan, and then we'll turn to Nathan.
No, I think you're exactly right. It's been going, I think, exceptionally well. I mean, I can understand why people from the outside, particularly a particular sort of political viewpoints, aren't happy with the 2-2 FCC. And I know on the outset there was a lot of predictions about the FCC potentially being, gridlocked or deadlocked, and that certainly was, I guess, theoretically at least, an option. But really, I think kudos to the chair, to Symington, to all of us. We have gone a very different path at the FCC. We have not gone to our corners. We've not gridlocked or deadlocked the agency. All of us are working to the middle. I think it's very unique in Washington to have something that is, 2-2, totally evenly split. And yet, instead of just, going to the corners and talking about extreme issues, we're working oftentimes behind the scenes to find common ground. We've done that. We've done it on, spectrum matters, whether it's the early 3.5 gigahertz auction, the 2.5 gigahertz auction. We've done it on national security, including taking some unprecedented steps to address unique national security threats. We've done that together. Telehealth, we've worked to promote that. We've stood up totally from scratch in a very short order, a total of $24 billion worth of various low-income support programs as well, and found common ground on all of that. We've worked on some competition issues, a cable MDU, multi-dwelling unit issue. We've worked on promoting wireless resiliency. So, all these things are mentioned are not things that necessarily I would have done if I had the complete pen, but it's an example of right now we're getting good common sense stuff done. I think there's additional low-hanging fruit that we can continue to run on. And so I think it is, for whatever reason, it's a very unique moment at the FCC where we're working together, compromising, getting good policy done.
Commissioner Symington, unlike Commissioner Carr, you've known nothing else but this situation with the current split. So give us your thoughts on it and how you think it's affected your work in one way or the other.
Absolutely. Well, I did serve for 1 month under Chairman Carr, so there was 1 month of majority. But and that was a very busy month because we were busy finalizing all of the chairman's remaining agenda prior to his resignation. So I would say, first of all, I would agree with everything that my colleague Commissioner Carr said, but I guess I would add to that the chairwoman clearly enjoys the confidence of the Senate. She was reconfirmed with a bipartisan vote, and our oversight has been, I think, very congenial, and there haven't really been a lot of points of tension. This is probably because we've been concentrating on delivering an agenda that's broadly bipartisan acceptable to majorities in both houses, and as such, we are just reflective of the mood of the country as a whole. Now, any party has the potential of being captured by its fringes. And I think what we're seeing right now is exactly the opposite dynamic. When people talk about partisan deadlock at the FCC, what they usually really mean is that they want us to do a net neutrality item. And my question is, does Congress want to see us do a net neutrality item right now, or would they rather that we concentrate on delivering on the programs and initiatives that Commissioner Carr has talked about? And I think we're in accordance with the sentiment of the country here, and so the potential 2-2 gridlock situation has turned into a 4-0 unanimity situation where, as Commissioner Carr said, if maybe if we held the pen on particular items, we might approach some things in a slightly different way. But that's not getting us close to the point of actually wanting to tank items. And quite the contrary, I think we want to get the country's business done, and it's being done in a broadly acceptable way.
You know, I may come back to net neutrality later or not, but I don't think either of you were here.
Same with the FCC, yeah.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Earlier today, Christopher Yu was on a panel, you know, one of our scholars that's a member of our board of academic advisors. And, you know, I told our audience that I first met Christopher when I invited him to speak at a public policy event back in 2004 on the subject of net neutrality. He had just written a paper, 2004. What's this, 2023? And we're still talking about it. But maybe there's more agreement now that, you know, that it's not needed in the same way. But anyway, I'm not here to give you my opinion too much. But what I do want to talk about, and the panel ended on this subject, so let's maybe pick it up now, and that's the Affordable Connectivity Program. There's a lot of concern that the money that has already been appropriated will run out. You know, it's a $14 billion appropriation. So I just ask the question simply this way: do you think that program should be extended based on what you know about how it's working and you'd like to see it work? And if it is extended, what suggestions do you have, if any, for improving it going forward, whether it's in combating waste, fraud, and abuse, or changing eligibility, or whatever? I'll try to go back and forth. I'll give you the first crack.
Well, thanks very much. As you said, Randy, there's a mismatch between the appropriation and the potential demand. And any appropriation-funded program has a potential longevity problem as well. If there's no innate mechanism, Congress has to deliberately pick it up every time. So ACP, of course, was designed to have very broad eligibility criteria, and the staff worked hard on it. But we adopted a substantially similar approach to that used in Lifeline, and so we certainly could crack down on potential for waste, fraud, and abuse. For example, requiring stronger identity verification measures such as a social security number. But there's also a question of what happens when you offer a program that's appropriation funded to 40% of the country, more or less. If everyone who is eligible for ACP signed up, then the appropriation would be gone in less than a year. We think specifically that there would be 18 billion possible of annual spend, more or less, given the number of households eligible for it. And contrasting that against a 14-some billion original appropriation, you can see the problem. Also, we have to ask the question what the point of this program was. Was it to get people online, or was it to subsidize habits of consumption that already existed? Because if it's the latter, that's a different conversation. Should it be renewed? Well, there's a larger question about what sorts of affordability programs should be out there, what the base of funding should be like, and that ties into larger questions of what the future of the universal service programs look like. We're in a very different place now than 1996. Funding it off of a telephone base seems increasingly unsustainable as the base shrinks. I think the question of whether ACP should be renewed ties into the question of who exactly we hope it to reach now that we're somewhat out of the COVID crisis, what the expected source of funding should be, and what the goals are that the program is intended to accomplish. And I think all of those remain somewhat to be defined as we look at what the next phase of that program will be. Okay.
Don't forget to tweet. You can tweet after lunch as well as you could have before lunch, and you've got the hashtag on the table there. Commissioner Carr, your thoughts on ACP and the extension of ACP going forward?
Yeah, well, My instinct is that ACP, my gut is that it's been a very attractive program. I think if you compare it in particular to Lifeline, we saw a lot of undersubscription in Lifeline, people that could have adopted the program, not subscribing to it. I know Commissioner Riley, who was on a prior panel, put forward a very thoughtful sort of piece on ACP that I commend to people. The ultimate question, obviously, is one for Congress. So I don't want to go too far down the path of sort of getting involved in what will be a congressional decision on to renew it or not. But one thing that I think is important as a step to informing that is additional hard data. So, for instance, one of the things that I push for through ACP is try to get more data as to the consumers, what they had, if anything, before. Because what I've sort of always said is that the target for ACP has to be, among other things, those people that were on the wrong side of the digital divide, those people that didn't have internet connectivity. And we're taking those people that had nothing and targeting the program appropriately to bring them across the divide with a affordable internet connection. So I think one thing that, in my view, should be informing Congress is some additional hard data about the participants in the program and where they were, if at all, prior to enrollment. I think that could inform questions about, obviously, whether to do it, where to target it, and sort of levels of support necessary. So I think that more hard data is going to be key.
Picking up on the point about the hard data, I'll just give my view briefly. To me, I think it is an important program, but like all of these programs that involve so many billions of dollars, there's oversight's important and preventing fraud and abuse. But one thing that's attractive from my point of view as a free market-oriented person is that, unlike the Lifeline program, for example, the consumer gets to make a choice. He gets, in effect, a voucher. I don't think it's called a voucher technically, but he gets a voucher and can choose which provider that he wants to go to. And so that element of consumer choice, again, from a market perspective, I think is something that's valuable. But, Brendan, just picking up on your point about the data, I think it would be interesting for me to know you talked about, which consumers are getting it, but also which providers are actually getting the money, because I think it also has the potential to provoke or spur additional competition, perhaps by virtue of the fact that this money, is there and can go to additional choices. I think there are 20. I think the list I saw, showed that there were 20 different providers. There were actually President Biden, I think, when they had an event recently, they posted on their website there were 1,300 or so providers. But when you look at the list, that was because the affiliates of each state were, under the rubric of the larger company. But if there are 20 different providers, then it's conceivable that these vouchers are perhaps being used in some places to spur competition, or at least there's the opportunity for that. So that's a piece of data I'd be interested in knowing. But in any event, at least from the way the thing was established, it is market-oriented in a way that I think could be useful. So that's the adoption piece we've been talking about with ACP. And I want to turn to the deployment part of it. When we talk about deployment, we're talking about the BEAD program. Does anyone still remember what BEAD, I just say, anyone remember what BEAD stands for? Probably you do. That's okay. But you've got BEAD, which NTIA is administering. You've got the Treasury Department has a whole bunch of money. You've got the Agriculture Department has a bunch of money. And I think when you total up the amounts of money, funds that have been appropriated, you've got over $400 billion that could be used for broadband deployment. and of that $400 billion, an absolute minimum of $60 billion, that's the minimum, is going to be spent on broadband infrastructure. And there are 115 broadband-related programs spread across 15 different agencies. I think Senator Thune mentioned that number this morning, as well as others. So I just wanted to discuss from your perspective, and I know that the FCC is not administering BEAD. I get that, but I think the FCC and you commissioners are obviously closely watching and very much interested in how this works, how it is working. So I want to get your thoughts on that, and then I guess in the context of doing that, maybe you can tie it in. And Commissioner Symington, you alluded to this. There is the existing USF program, which exists, and but that's a $9 billion program. And so I think the question is raised: how do is there a need for that program going forward at all? If so, in what form? Or should that really go away in light of this money? All of that together. So I'm going to turn to Brendan this time and just take on the deployment side and where things stand and how they're working and what you would like to see changed and anything that's bugging you lately.
Yeah, that last was a really broad question. I could go a lot of different ways. What's bugging me lately? The question with BEAD is really interesting. I really like the commitment to bridging the digital divide that BEAD represents, that down payment on enough money that if administered correctly is going to get the job done. I like that. They're working hard over there. I do have some concerns with some of the policy cuts that BEAD has made. I mean, not surprisingly, I would have sort of different policy cuts than the officials over there right now. But I'm worried that some of the policy cuts they're making are going to result in us burning through a lot of that money before we get the job done. And one of those has to do with the drafters of the legislation, the Infrastructure Act, worked together. We were very, very clear. The lead drafters said we are not imposing any technological preference at all. And whether you think there should be or shouldn't be a technological preference is a different debate. That debate was taken off the table by the legislation. Now we have to implement it. And yet if you look at BEAD, I do think they put not just a preference, but a very, very heavy thumb on the scale for fiber. I personally have voted for fiber preferences. I would sort of insist on voting for fiber preferences going forward. But against the backdrop of the decision being made in the statute, I think what ended up happening through the BEAD guidance was pushing too far. And what I mean by that is I think we have to leave room in at least 1 or 2%, at least edge cases where fixed wireless can get the job done very quickly, very efficiently. I've seen that as I've sort of traveled around the country. I was just in small county, Jessamine County, Kentucky, very sort of rural area. It's rolling hills, small farms. I met with a fixed wireless provider, John. He had actually, with his dad, they'd put up a small antenna structure, a small tower, put a fixed wireless antenna on it, beamed to a water tower that they had a facility about 6 miles away, and they were bringing 100 megabit per second high-speed service to a place that just had DSL before that. All in to do that particular build was probably something like $2,500. The closest fiber point is 1 to 2 miles away. You're looking at $50,000 to $60,000 a mile for fiber, and so you pretty quickly get to see, when we have that type of fixed wireless scenario, at least in some cases, we can get done faster than the years it would take to get fiber there, and for $2,500 as opposed to $60,000 plus. And the risk we have right now is that we're going to take places like that community that John is serving, and we're going to label it, according to the BEAD preferences, as the same as a place that has 0 megabits over 0 megabits per second. When you look at the work that we have to get done, putting that much resources into overbuilding investment based on an incorrect view that we're just going to treat this like that's 0 over 0, even though it has 100 megabits per second, I think it's not a good result. I think that's going to result in wasted resources. I've tried to address this in part by meeting directly with state broadband officials to emphasize, look, to the extent you have discretion under BEAD, which some of them do, and you put forward your plans, include at least some scenarios where, again, 90+% fiber, have at it. But let's leave some scenarios where fixed wireless or other technologies may make sense. And if we get that right, if we correct for the sort of what I view as the BEAD mistake at the state level, that would be a good thing. I've met with the Kentucky broadband officials, met with Utah broadband officials to try to sort of push that. Because I think, again, top-level funding is a good thing. If we don't correct for some of these policy errors, we're going to leave people stuck on the wrong side of the digital divide. So I think overbuilding of unlicensed spectrum, fixed wireless is one piece of it. Obviously, there's some thumbs on the scale for rate regulation. There's other sort of political decisions, I think, that got added to that BEAD guidance late that I don't think is a great result.
You're not happy to see those thumbs on the scale for rate regulation, I take it.
Yeah, one of the pieces of it is, sort of targeting price points at 3 different price points. I think that could, depending on how the states deal with that and the flexibility that Commerce gives, could be a problem. You've got sort of heavy preferences, at least apparently, for unionized workforces, which different states can make their decisions. But if you have a right-to-work state, for instance, like South Dakota, and you're faced with an existing crunch on the workforce side, I think that could lead to some poor outcomes.
Commissioner Symington, talk about deployment and BEAD and these other programs.
Well, I love Commissioner Carr's example of a specific unlicensed spectrum, right?
Yep.
Rural wireless build. That's a concrete example of something that a fiber preference would tend to overlook. But looking at it through the other end of the telescope, you could just as much say that if everyone has a fiber preference, then no one does, because there's a limited supply of fiber and everyone's rivalrous for it, and that becomes rivalrous to other valuable uses for fiber. When you look at international broadband deployments in countries that didn't have a large prior existing cable plant, very often their model is primarily fixed wireless. And so it's obvious why we're going to think in terms of DSL evolving into cable, evolving into fiber, because that's the technological plant that we already had as an installed base in the United States. I don't think that necessarily means that fiber to the home should be the default model going forward. Obviously, in some situations, you would have to lay a lot of fiber to get to a relatively small number of residences. Or on the other hand, in a large center, and I realize we're talking about rural programs here, but just generally thinking about the concept of fiber preference, in an urban center, it may well be more economical to use an advanced high-frequency wireless system than it would be to start ripping up the ground yet again in New York City. So the government has a decidedly mixed record at judging in advance which way things are going to develop. And to the extent that there's any government body that's best poised to make these decisions, it's, on the one hand, the local knowledge probably resides at the state level, and on the other hand, many states don't traditionally have a broadband office or much experience in planning and deploying builds. So there's going to be a lot of sources of tension and push-pull as we work towards getting to the kind of full coverage and full closure of the digital divide that's specified as the goal here. I guess one other comment regarding fiber specifically. There's been a lot of attention paid to the symmetrical upload-download capabilities of fiber, and I don't really know what that's reaching for. Obviously, an earlier version of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and the one that passed did explicitly include symmetry, 100 up, 100 down. That eventually got changed to just 20 up versus 100 down. From looking at the numbers in actual usage, I don't think I've found a case study where the ratio of where the ratio of up to down was more than 1 to 14. So consumers generally are doing a lot of downloading and not nearly as much uploading, even in a video chat scenario such as working from home. And then adding to that, some 80% of IP traffic in the United States is now streaming video, and that's per se going from a server or a CDN to a consumer. And to the extent that we've made a decision that high-speed streaming should be a capability, consumers have mainly adopted this, at least at this point, in the form of downloads instead of uploads. So I could understand some technical reasons that you might want symmetry in planning your builds, but I just don't see the consumer uptake for that. And that, again, smacks of making one decision in the guise of another one. I guess just one final point here. When we are talking about deploying the amount of public money that we're talking about deploying, and as you note, it's potentially reaching into the hundreds of billions of dollars, then we have to ask to what degree we're locking ourselves into a particular technological pathway. And so, if we had decided that that broadband was a human right in 1996, and immediately poured huge amounts of money into existing broadband capabilities, then by now the United States would have the most advanced, built out, and path-dependent DSL system in the world. And I'm just not willing to commit to that. I don't know what the future of wireless networking looks like. I don't know what the future of wireline capacity demand looks like. And the goal of getting all Americans over the digital divide shouldn't lead us to constantly redefine what it means to be on the wrong side of the digital divide. So there are always people who are underserved just because they don't have 1 gigabit bit symmetrical upload download. At some point we've got to have a limiting principle and say, this is broadly acceptable standards for broadband, and we're not going to change our minds every year.
Okay, well, speaking of the future, which you just did, the FCC does have this open proceeding, an inquiry. I think it's styled the future of universal service. I believe I recall that. So I do want to just see whether you have any, we talked about everything that's being done with the appropriated money, and each of you have given some views that are important to consider. At least in my mind, maybe it's only in my mind, but there is a question about the rationale, perhaps, going forward for the continuing the universal service programs, at least in their current form. I mean, I've been a longtime proponent of Lifeline service because it's a safety net program properly. If it's run properly, I think it's important. But we just talked about that connectivity. ACP. So just if you wish to comment on the future of universal service, and Brendan, since I mentioned you were a former FCC general counsel, I'm just going to put you on the spot and ask you if you care to comment on it. There was the universal service program has been challenged on constitutional grounds too, and there was just a decision by the Fifth Circuit, which rejected the constitutional challenges that were brought on non-delegation grounds. So you've got that judicial activity too. So why don't you comment on USF, and then I'll give Commissioner Symington an opportunity.
Yeah, I think USF obviously is a vitally important program, and I think it's therefore incumbent on the FCC to make sure that we have it on stable, sustainable financial footing. And one of the issues that I've highlighted is that we are effectively sort of heading in the direction of a death spiral when it comes to the funding mechanism for universal service. Obviously, as everyone here knows, we effectively put an assessment on people's monthly telephone bills. That's how we get the roughly $9 billion. But as telephone revenues are declining, we are increasing that assessment up to 30% now. And when you play that forward a couple of years, it really doesn't look pretty. And so I said that we should basically go with past as prologue, look back to the purpose of USF originally in terms of the funding model was what are the businesses that are benefiting, in addition to individual consumers, the businesses that benefit from universal service. Back then it was traditional enterprise businesses. They paid the lion's share, or at least a significant share of the costs through all these extra charges that businesses had, whether it was fax lines, 1-800 services, long distance calling that businesses were predominantly involved in many cases. Flash forward to today, and the businesses that benefit, in addition to consumers, from these expenditures increasingly is large technology companies, whether it's digital advertising, streamers. And so I think we need to return to this idea of the big businesses that are benefiting from USF kicking in to contribute to support. I think that's going to be vital to the long-term sustainability of USF. And I think that's a reform that we could bite off and get done.
Nathan?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you know what they say about network effects? It doesn't do you any good to have a phone if you're the only one. And network effects of pervasive broadband scale across technology companies and not across ISPs. So, if whether I'm for example, a broadband customer of Coax or Charter or Comcast or some other company that doesn't start with a C, but that I'll still most likely have an Amazon account, and Google will make money off my browsing in various ways. I probably have a Facebook account or Instagram or WhatsApp or something. So, so every time there's a broadband consumer added by any ISP, there's a broadband consumer who enters the app ecosystem at multiple points. And so, you know, Commissioner Carr is raising this question of these companies that are beneficiaries. I guess I would say that that the large technology companies are much more the beneficiaries of the overall network effect of people joining the broadband ecosystem than any individual ISP could ever be. And so if you look at how we thought about assessing the AT&T monopoly, and I realize that we're now 41 years past that, but it still informs much of what we do. You know, it informs how Title II was written. It informs the whole concept of universal service, which evolved from a very different idea of universal service throughout the Bell system at one point. Then it seems funny that that we're looking at the funding source for these programs as just coming out of the declining telephone sector, as Commissioner Carr pointed out. As far as what it would mean to evolve these programs and to evolve their funding sources, some people have suggested moving the assessment onto home broadband services. Well, I think that, that's certainly possible. I feel like that sort of misses the point, though, about network effects by transferring the burden onto ISP consumers and most likely subsidizing on one hand what you're assessing from on the other, in a lot of cases. But then looking at the future of these programs, we have to acknowledge that there's a huge amount of path dependency. People have, school systems have budgeted for decades on the expectation that E-rate would be there. There are very many specific installations that were built out on the basis of having access to the telehealth and high cost funding, and taking that away with no plan for how to replace it would obviously cause a lot of things to shutter and a lot of people to have their lives disrupted. So thinking about evolving the programs has got to do so in a way that isn't disruptive to people who've made commitments in the reasonable expectation that they would continue. On the other hand, the system as it is not sustainable, so we're going to have to make those decisions soon and figure out how to do a lot of these transitions. Whether that's, the simplest way would simply be to address things at the funding level and then figure out how to evolve the programs on that basis. But if we don't address the funding level, then we're just going to have a crisis where there are too many demands on dollars and not enough dollars going around.
Okay. So the next topic, I want to turn to a spectrum, and I'll say 5G there as well. And obviously some of that, I know we've alluded to fixed wireless, so I understand that uses spectrum, and we may have covered a bit of it, but I'm going to throw out several things that I think fit under that topic, and you guys can just choose. But I'm going to save TikTok. That's going to come. That's going to be a separate topic.
Very hesitant to talk about that, so okay. I don't know if you want to go there.
Okay. Yeah, I figured. So, but we've got under spectrum. The auction authority has expired. Now. So, one thought I had, or question is, and I understand you're not in Congress, but you have a lot of influence and able to make your views known. What would you like to see in terms of an extension of auction authority, and how detailed should Congress be in terms of specifying which spectrum bands should be auctioned next and in what order and so forth? Another question that comes to mind has to do with the coordination of spectrum among the executive branch agencies and the FCC, or between the FCC and the executive branch agencies. And I know there's agreements being reached between the Chairwoman Rosen Warsall and TIA. I'm curious as to how well you think they may be working, whether you've seen any improvements. We all know about some of the past problems, what you hope to see there. NTA has just announced it wants to develop, or is going to develop, a national spectrum strategy. Seems like we've tried to do that before, but I guess maybe not finished it. And what you think about that, and then I'll just throw in this. And again, you don't have to touch on everything, but you can pick and choose. Commissioner Carr, I know that you have been really instrumental, and still are, I think, in raising issues about the siting obstacles that sometimes delay or even prevent the deployment of wireless facilities. And I mean, I know you played a key role in some of the FCC's earlier decisions. I still see photos of you climbing towers with your hard hat on periodically. I don't know whether they're always new photos or whether I just keep seeing the same one. but anyway, when you're doing that, I know it relates to getting facilities deployed. So, right. So let's just talk for a few minutes about spectrum, its importance, and why don't you go first, and then Nathan.
Well, look, our Spectrum Auction Authority has expired. That is an unprecedented development, and it is deeply concerning. And I think for me, it's part and parcel of a broader concern that I have with respect to the sort of apparent Plutoing of the FCC when it comes to the tech and technology sector. I mean, obviously, I think we do a great job with universal service. We see a lot of those dollars now moving over to commerce with BEAD. I think we need to, as someone that, I'm biased, I'm at the FCC, I work at the FCC, I think it's important that we continue to play a lead role in a lot of these initiatives. When you look at spectrum in particular, there's a couple different ways to look at it, both in terms of what I view as the impact in terms of our ability to continue to auction spectrum, continue to connect millions and millions of Americans with opportunity. Not good. At another level, you look at it in terms of our stature. I think this one is really important, is if you zoom out, why is America's wireless leadership so important? And the reason why America's wireless leadership is important is because it is integral to our geopolitical leadership. When the U.S. frees, clears, auctions spectrum, makes unlicensed spectrum available, when we make moves on spectrum, the world watches, and all of our allies are able to benefit from strong U.S. leadership on spectrum. We free up spectrum. The standard-setting bodies know that. There's focus and intention on how do we create standards that work for the U.S. since they're the first mover on spectrum. You look at devices and how they're developed. You look at investment and where it flows. It flows to the countries that are showing leadership in wireless. And there's nothing that countries that are not allied with us want to see more than to have the U.S.'s wireless leadership taken down a notch. And that makes it very easy, makes it easier for unallied nations to go into standard-setting bodies, to go into these live debates that are taking place in the lead up to international spectrum conferences and push their agenda and their viewpoints. So U.S. wireless leadership, of which having Spectrum Auction Authority is a piece, continuing to move forward with freeing up mid-band spectrum, all of this is part of U.S. leadership. And it's important, again, not just for the day-to-day connectivity, but it's a part of U.S. geopolitical leadership. I think it's important that we frame it up that way, because the future looks a lot worse for U.S. on the global stage if we aren't a country that's in the top tier of moving quickly on spectrum bands. The world's focus, the world's attention, investment focus, negotiating leverage in all of these international conferences cede towards authoritarian regimes if the U.S. isn't leading on spectrum.
Commissioner Symington.
That's just such a great point from Commissioner Carr. I could not agree more. I was speaking with a leading tech executive about a year ago who gave me some numbers and said, on the one hand, you Americans, you're our single biggest market. You're 35% of our entire world market, but that leaves another 65%. So on the one hand, what you do has huge implications, but on the other hand, if you don't lead, it's hard for us to lead as well. Or if you lead in a strange direction, frankly, that we can't deal with or market to other countries, that there can't be a larger American ecosystem, then our tech that's made for your market will tend to stagnate. And I thought that that was a particularly interesting point in connection with 5G, because of course 5G is a fantastic wireless mobility technology, but it's just generally adapted to things other than just wireless mobility. It's possible to have much denser a number of devices, in a given area with 5G. It's possible to have planes with different priorities and privileges and functionality, and thus to have effectively multiple services in a single geographic area. And then the low latency features of 5G have obvious consumer applications such as VR and AR, but they also have obvious industrial control applications, which are potentially medical and public safety applications. So there are lots of great things that we can get with 5G development besides just downloading a movie on your phone a little faster. The truth is the cell phone is only part of a potential larger 5G ecosystem. And so continuing to free up spectrum for commercial use is a very important part of that ecosystem's development. Otherwise, frankly, the huge existing and growing demand for wireless mobility data will wind up swamping out the other applications, because those customers are right here, right now, and willing to pay for 5G and willing to shop for service on the basis of its availability. So, if the wireless mobility industry can't keep delivering improved quality of service in that area, it's bad for the sector. Therefore, the implication for our auction authority, I don't think the conflict in Congress really is over whether the FCC should have auction authority. I hope it isn't. I mean, I checked. The last time we didn't have auction authority, I was 14. So it's something I've lived with my entire life. And in fact, I wasn't even a U.S. citizen at the time, nor for some years later. So spectrum auction authority is really part of how every developed country thinks about spectrum in this day and age. I mean, Americans have won Nobel Prizes over spectrum auctions. It's a significant policy innovation that we have that's been so successful that it's gone global. And I don't think Congress is really looking to unseat that, but they are looking at how to manage the relationship between the FCC and standing as proxy for the commercial sector and the federal sector, so that we don't wind up having these awful conflicts every year. So it strikes me that one way that Congress could resolve this would be to define a term for spectrum authority and to tie that to specific bands that Congress is going to authorize and require for auction and commercialization on that basis. The nice thing about Congress making this decision is that it's no longer a peer-to-peer conflict between agencies on this. It's simply the agencies carrying out the directives that Congress, with its superior authority, has issued. So that would be one way of resolving the situation, and in any case, I'm confident Congress will resolve it soon, and that the present situation is just a temporary anomaly.
Okay. We covered a lot there, and I apologize if I just missed this, but there has been the question, or even I should say problem of the conflicts between the FCC and the executive branch that we've witnessed over the past number of years. Are you optimistic that we may avoid some of those in the future? Do you think there's progress that's been made? If you address that, I apologize.
No.
But I'm just kidding.
Look, there's been a lot of sort of discussion recently about increasing the number of MOUs and meetings between the FCC and all the stakeholders. I think all that's fine, but look, where the rubber meets the road is we have to keep moving spectrum through the pipeline. And the greatest test of whether all of this focus on process works is it producing additional spectrum or is it not? And at the moment, at least with a lack of auction authority, we're not producing a lot of new spectrum. And I think, as I've long said, we have to keep moving on spectrum at the same pace and cadence that we hit it the last couple of years. Coming on the heels of when Chairman Pai, when Pai was chair of the FCC, we got a lot of good things done on spectrum, particularly mid-band. We got 2.5 done. We got some 3.45 CBRS spectrum done. We got 4.9. We got 5.9. We got C-band. We got 1,200 megahertz and 6 gigahertz. We put up a lot of W's on the board on mid-band spectrum. And in March of 21, I gave a speech where I laid out 6 or 7 bands that I thought in 21, in 22, and 23 we could move on. And some of those continues to be low-hanging fruit. So I think even with auction authority having a question mark at the moment, there's actually a lot that we can continue to get done on the spectrum side, including moving spectrum out for use.
So we are getting closer here to the final questions that I have. And unless Commissioners Carr and Symington object, I want to leave some time where we can have just a couple audience questions, which we've done throughout the program. And I will say, just about 10 minutes ago, just so I'll let you know, I got a message that Commissioner Wilson, remember I said she had COVID, but she wanted to appear, and I got a text message that she feels too sick. Earlier today, she thought she could do it, but it's not going to be able to be here, be with us over Zoom. So that'll just give us a few extra minutes here today for questions. So what I want to do.
Don't everybody get up and leave since she's not going to be here. Don't, we'll still get some more content out for you.
And I checked with Zoom too, and and I thought it would be safe to do it, and it would have been. So I want to do, just so you guys know, I want to hit under, I've got a subheading here, national security, that I want to address. That's really becoming more important over at the Commission than it had been. And then receiver interference standards. And then I've got a final question. So Commissioner Carr, as I just said, it seems like more than ever, or more than probably in the last 20 years combined, in the last couple of years, the FCC's been dealing with issues that I would put under national security, and that includes has to do with things like equipment, security of the equipment, and so forth. And I know that's an area you've been interested in. I know you've talked quite a bit about TikTok, and TikTok's been in the news a bit in the last couple of days as well. But I'm going to pose this question as a way of handing it off to you. Some people say, I've heard it said that the FCC doesn't have any jurisdiction over TikTok, or you're spending all this time on TikTok, and it's a bit out of your lane, to use that expression. I'm not subscribing to those views myself, but others have. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that, and anything relating to the FCC's proceedings that are important for the national security.
Yeah, I think we have a deep and long expertise on national security issues at the FCC, and it kind of clusters around this idea of entities with ties back to certain foreign regimes and data flows. And so we look at that on a lot of different levels. Obviously, we started with Huawei, we did ZTE, we've focused on China Mobile, China Unicom, China Telecom, the 214 context. So we've worked at the device layer, again, Huawei. We've looked at the carrier level, the 214 authorizations, as I mentioned. I think another place we need to look as a country, obviously, is the application level. That's where TikTok is. As you note, direct regulatory role there would either be Federal Trade Commission, Treasury, which has had this 2+ year review ongoing, or Congress, and there's potential activity on all of those. But I think it's important for those of us that have developed some understanding of the nexus of these types of issues to speak out about it, and I've done that. But there's more we can do with the FCC as well. We had this Secure Equipment Act that was passed that gave us authority to deny equipment authorizations to devices on our covered list. We teed up some questions there about whether we should go back and look at revoking existing authorizations, and that's something that I think we should do. We have entities like China Mobile that we have denied 214s, but there's entities that continue to operate in the country in a non-214 authorization sense. So for instance, operating data centers or other types of things like that. I think that we need to look at, and this isn't breaking news, I've said this before, we should be looking at carriers we do regulate and look at interconnection, whether we should be prohibiting the interconnection with entities that we have revoked on national security grounds their 214 authorizations. So I think we've worked really, really well. I think Chairman Rosenworcel deserves a lot of credit. We've put up a lot of wins on the board in terms of addressing FCC-related national security issues, and I think that there's more to go. And I think, the last week at the House hearing with the TikTok CEO, I think I sat in that same chair. I've testified many times before that same committee, and what I saw there was unprecedented. I mean, for one, doing something that I didn't think was possible, which was basically getting bipartisan unanimity on an issue. There was a tremendous amount of skepticism about the responses and the evasive nature of the responses that the TikTok CEO was giving. Usually when you go to a hearing, you don't want to make it clear and sort of in a bipartisan way that you're giving evasive answers, but I think this was a situation where being truthful and more direct, they made the judgment call would have been even more damaging than the evasive answers that they gave. So I think it was very, very good to see that continue building bipartisan concern with TikTok. I think it's sort of a low-hanging fruit at this point in terms of it's run through a process, 2 years, CFIUS. I think we need to do that. There's a lot of focus as well on privacy, and I do think we need baseline privacy protections in the country, but they're two different things. If you look, for instance, at Europe, they have what a lot of consumer organizations would view as a gold standard approach to privacy, GDPR, and others. If you look, individual countries in Europe right now are imposing at least partial bans on TikTok. So I think that shows us that each of those things can potentially be important, but they're not necessarily a substitute for each other. So I do think it's important that we continue to move forward on TikTok.
Yeah, well, you mentioned unanimity. Remember when I introduced you, I pointed out that you were confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate. So, it happens once in a while. Commissioner Carr, I'm sorry, Commissioner Simon, you can also, of course, I'd be pleased for you to comment too on national security, but I especially want you to comment on the FCC's consideration of adopting receiver interference standards. That's an issue that not many people were talking about before you became a commissioner. I mean, it's been talked about, of course, for decades at different times and assumed more or less importance, but you obviously believe it's an important issue and you've pushed it. So tell us why and where matters stand right now.
Absolutely. Randy, I'm just going to turn back to Commissioner Carr's security comments just for 1 second. Now, he raised a lot of great issues. The role of the FCC in non-app, but nonetheless app implicating and telecommunications company implicating security questions. I just want to point out that the FCC is not currently regulating the edge space, but there's that doesn't necessarily have to last forever. A lot of our statutory mandates, for example, whether those are regarding broadcasting or whether those are regarding, say, functional equivalence in telephony for the disabled, whatever they may be, they'll become increasingly hollow shells of themselves unless and until Congress decides to decide to what degree the FCC should move into the app ecosystem. Now, of course, Congress has made no such action yet, and I'm not claiming any jurisdiction before Congress chooses to act. I guess I'm just pointing out that if we're to perform our traditional functions, the question has got to be, is anyone going to be regulating the app space, and if not us, who? And to the extent that they're not, to what degree are people, for example, the disabled who have legitimate expectations about functional equivalence in telephony, going to be able to rely on non-telephony telephony? And to what degree, likewise, are people going to be able to have expectations of the linear video sector if the question is just, is it facilities-based or not? And to what degree does the public think that should be the entire basis for whether you fall into a regulatory regime or not? Just touching briefly on, one aspect of the security question that I think maybe doesn't get talked about enough. I hope this works. I'm going to do a little James Bond thing here. in terms of the integrity of signal, I'm going to talk about receivers, I promise, in just a second. But there's also a question of, thank you, of the increased. I'm just going to shout out loud while this is getting done. Oh, even better. Thank you so much. Perfect. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much. So in terms of people's expectations for spectrum integrity and the safeguarding of the public interest in functional broadcast spectrum, increasingly devices have a software component. And we license devices, of course, in terms of frequency and power level and antenna design and whatnot. And to the degree that those are software mutable, then you could take a device that's conforming and change it to a non-conforming device with some simple software modifications or reflashing the firmware. And by doing that, that opens up a security domain to licensing of equipment that I don't think had existed prior. And traditionally, we didn't look into the software. Maybe we won't be able to avoid that question forever. Turning to the spectral efficiency question. We have been talking about the idea of what receiver standards would look like at the Commission for a while. I remember talking to one engineer who pointed out that the issue goes back at least to UHF reception capabilities in the 70s. I think that might have been the first time that the Commission considered the question. And I think the answer that they came to then is largely one that I came to now myself, that the Commission just is not technically equipped to mandate receiver standards. I don't think there's a way that we could do it without getting overly prescriptive. And I also think that a receiver performance standard is much, much, much harder to define than a transmission standard. It's highly contextual. It depends on the overall RF environment. It depends on the terrain. And any rules that we were to put out that would be prescriptive as to defining and requiring a particular level of receiver performance would open up more problems than they would solve. However, it's also true that they aren't making any new spectrum. And, well, maybe a little bit. We're starting to talk about opening up terahertz as a concept, but that's still very much experimental. There's all of the low-hanging fruit has definitely been picked in the spectrum world. And it's all brownfield, it's not greenfield. And so the question becomes, to what degree do we have to defer forever in favor of incumbent services that have superannuated receiver quality, whether it's just become market practice to have receivers that are less capable in terms of rejection than in other sections? To what degree is it acceptable to have receivers that are effectively listening in on distant bands as a market practice, just because at one point there was an expectation that nearby bands would be quiet? That's like an air and light easement that runs forever at no cost and that stops you from building another skyscraper in favor of a single family house. And at a certain point you have to say, to what degree is spectrum NIMBYism an explicit policy goal of Congress as opposed to just something that happened? So my view is that the road forward would likely be that the Commission would look towards turning the current receiver proceeding into an NPRM at some point down the road. I would love to see that soon. That took an approach that forward-oriented band planning would include a consideration of the capabilities of the receivers that were contemplated to be used in the service at the time that it was opened. And at minimum, we would have some sort of an idea from doing that what the expectations were for receiver behavior in a way that would expose it to notice and comment rulemaking by all competent players within industry, and of course by the general public. And by doing that and just putting something on paper about the receiver characteristics that are expected in that band, we've opened that to discussion, we've opened it to a basis of comparison, and we've opened it to finding potential problems with nearby reclassifications in a way that's explicitly on the record and exposed to our rulemaking procedures, instead of just allowing it to be tacit and sit behind the scenes. I think by raising this question, we will foreground receiver performance as a question without attempting to regulate it in a way that could be very harmful, given the Commission is not ready to step into being the R&D sector for every receiver manufacturer in the world, which is what we'd effectively have to be. If someone's going to give me budget to hire 100,000 engineers, maybe I'd think about it.
Okay, thank you for that, Commissioner. Okay, well, my last question is this. This is the 15th, anniversary of our policy conference, 15th annual conference here. And it's safe to say that every one of these 15 annual conferences, and a bunch of events in between, we've talked about net neutrality. Hard to believe, 15 years. So I want to ask this question this way, and we're just going to shortcut it. It's sort of halfway facetious, but of course there has to be an element of seriousness as well. There are really two parts. The first part I said, how in the world has the internet survived since 2018 without Title II regulations in place to regulate ISPs as if they were monopolistic telephone companies? Or maybe another way of asking that is, when Gigi Sohn withdrew her nomination just a couple weeks ago, and by the way, when she was nominated, I actually issued a statement. I think she and Jessica Rosenworcel, their nominations actually came together, and I congratulated them both and said I wish them well in their nominations. I said if they were confirmed, that I wish them well, but I was sure there may be some issues on which we might disagree. But I'll just add this about Gigi, consistent with what I said earlier about what we do at the Free State Foundation. She has appeared at our events a number of times, and I was happy to have her come to those events, pleased to have her come because of the diversity of opinion that she brought. And, I wouldn't be, we had Chris Lewis here earlier today, and I wouldn't be surprised, or in fact, I'd be shocked if at some time in the future I didn't have Gigi Sohn back, because I value that type of discussion and diversity. But here's, she, as part of her statement when she withdrew, she said this, I think referring to net neutrality, it seemed to me, said, this means that your broadband will be more expensive for lack of competition, and your private information will continue to be used and sold at the whim of your broadband provider. So, before we turn to the audience, just tell me how dire you think things are without net neutrality, or how well things are going on the other hand, and whether we need to go through the ordeal of another Title II proceeding, and whether you've convinced Chairman Rosenworcel that if there is a third member, that let's focus on other things. Brendan?
Look, I think the evidence at this point is clear. Over the last couple of years, we have seen competition increase. We have seen prices decline. We've had speeds increase, and we're seeing more and more innovation and new technologies be introduced. I was just in Barcelona at Mobile World Congress. One of the top European regulators, Thierry Breton, gave a speech there, and he said during COVID he had to call up, and he bragged about it, called up the top broadband providers the top streamers in Europe, and asked them to grade the quality of their stream, because he was afraid that the continent's networks would break. Here we didn't have that issue because we have such a high investment in our networks, and so I think that's very, very important. I also think, to the extent that people want to sort of rerun in the 2015 playbook on Title II, it's a very, very different world now here for a number of reasons. One, obviously, I think there's sort of the rhetoric far, far outpaced reality, obviously, leading up to our decision on Title II. I think people can see that with their own eyes, that they were told one thing about their internet experience, and they've now lived another thing for a number of years. But more important than that, I think, is the legal landscape is different, which is where, now post West Virginia versus EPA major questions, and whatever one thinks about the policy or other legal issues around Title II and the classification of broadband, I don't see how a reasonable person could put forth the argument that it isn't at least a major question. And so I think that Supreme Court precedent, which postdates the first time we did Title II, fundamentally changes the litigation risks and likelihood of that being sustained on appeal. I think finally, again, it's a policy matter. If you look back at people's own life over the last 3 to 4 years in the absence of Title II style net neutrality rules, and you look at where is discrimination taking place in the internet ecosystem against a bit, it's not taking place at the ISP level, but we've seen a lot of that take place at other levels, sort of what we call up the stack, including large technology companies engaged in discriminatory conduct. So I do think EPA case, in my view, is going to ultimately be fatal towards efforts to go back down this path with that type of major question. If people do decide to go back down this path, then I think they should be asking, up and down the stack, where is discrimination taking place against bits? Because at the end of the day, I don't sense that there is much disagreement on some basic rules of the road in terms of, no blocking, no sort of undisclosed throttling, these types of things. But if it's going to be sort of, myopically focused on, one sector of this broader ecosystem, I just don't think that makes policy sense, again, in addition to those threshold legal concerns I've raised.
Yeah, and by the way, regarding those legal concerns and the major questions doctrine, of course, and you're an expert on this too, but we've done a lot of writing at the Free State Foundation about the West Virginia decision, its likely import, really across the board, but including specifically the net neutrality regulation. And, I'll just point out that in the majority opinion in West Virginia, the Chief Justice Roberts actually cited Justice Kavanaugh's dissent in the U.S. Telecom case, the dissent from the rehearing, which was, to me, somewhat of a telegraphing of how they viewed it. But Nathan, what are your thoughts on reviving net neutrality at this point?
Well, I mean, I may yet pay 25 cents a tweet, but I won't pay it to my ISP. Remains to be seen. Pricing changes quite often. I think that would hit Commissioner Carr a little harder than that. So look, net neutrality is a slogan that can mean a lot of different things. When Chairman Powell called for net neutrality in 2004, he was talking about some things we don't even think about today, such as the right to run web applications freely, or the right to do free attachment of devices. I mean, every time you attach your iPad or your Apple TV or whatever it may be, I guess that's free attachment, which to people coming up today will seem very odd because they never experienced least CPE. So and that's, of course, substantially overlaps with the policy statement that the FCC adopted on the same topic in 2005. Now, if we're talking about whether practical net neutrality has been achieved in terms of no blocking, no throttling, and no preferential content fast lanes, I would say that that's substantially market practice today. If we're talking about whether net neutrality requires something higher, such as the full Title II regime designed for the AT&T monopoly, then obviously we don't have that right now, and it's not clear to me why we would want it. It's not clear to me what the consumer interest is that would be vindicated by that over where market practice is wound up. Now, does that mean that we've achieved network neutrality? Well, if we go back to the original 2003 paper that coined the phrase, what it was saying is that we should have general purpose networks, not specific purpose networks, that we should have networks with open protocols, not networks with closed proprietary protocols, and that we shouldn't prejudge what kind of content should be delivered over our networks. And again, I think those are goals that have substantively been achieved. And I don't even see any real connection between those and the Title II regulatory regime. Proponents of Title II these days are as likely to talk about build-out requirements and price controls as they are to talk about content blocking or your ISP attempting to dictate what you see. As Commissioner Carr just said, when people are complaining about their consumer internet experience these days, they're very often complaining about things that happen with the app and edge companies, and not at all with some sort of restrictions on their usage imposed exogenously by their ISPs. No one's being billed to visit specific websites unless I suppose it's a subscription site. But in that case, you're paying your edge provider. You don't pay a Netflix surcharge to go to Netflix.com. And to the degree that anyone was worried that we would see a vertical integration and walled gardens of content forming, well, that didn't happen at the ISP level, but now we have walled content gardens at the OTT level. So that just, again, shows how the focus is shifting from the app world elsewhere. I won't deny Gigi Sohn's comment that ISPs will make financial use of your data. On the other hand, I would ask what the market size is of that compared to app companies making use of your data. You know, we're very, very strict when CPNI is packaged and sold. And yet, my next question, when I learned about the degree to which CPNI was being packaged and sold, for example, as geographic data, was when we started cracking down on the practice, where did that move? And the answer is it moved to apps doing GPS pings. In other words, it moved from the regulated to the unregulated space. And so if the problem is that anti-consumer practices, or let's stipulate anti-consumer, I don't want to prejudge anything, but that claims that practices that we claim are anti-consumer are moving from the regulated to the unregulated space, how does further regulation of the regulated space help? That we're like the drunk looking for his car keys, you know, under the street light when he lost them in the alleyway because, you know, the light's better there. And you know, the real problem is we should be looking at the whole space and what consumer protection means, given how the internet has evolved. And in particular, one way that things have really changed from 2003 to today is that we've moved from being a largely peer-to-peer, node-to-node internet to being one dominated by various infrastructure, server, and ecosystem choke points that are, generally speaking, upstream of and distinct of the ISPs. And so conversation about people's consumer protections and internet experience have got to focus there. And long story short, I don't think Title II goes there.
Yeah. You know, Commissioner Symington, I was thinking as I was listening to you at the end that, you know, maybe next year we, you know, with good Lord willing and a little luck, maybe we wouldn't be talking about net neutrality. But you know what the reality is, and what I realize is that regardless of what the name is or whatever it's called, you know, there's always going to be a difference of perspective. I think the different views on, you know, how much regulation or how little regulation there should be regarding broadband and a bunch of other things. That's just the way it is. You know, I have, you know, a view. It's a free market, deregulatory view. But
Randy, it's been fun. I got to bounce.
What?
I'm getting the hook. I got a 2 o'clock.
Oh, okay. Well,
You're leaving me to face the music all by myself?
Yeah.
have you really got to bounce on one question?
Yeah, we take one quick question.
All right. If anyone has a question for Commissioner Carr, but okay. I see this young lady.
Hi.
You have to identify. Just go ahead and speak up. Go ahead, really quick.
Sorry.
So that's
I think he's got the question. Okay.
Yeah, no comment. We put out a joint statement a while ago and nothing more beyond that.
I stand by that joint statement as well. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to let's give. Can you stay for just a couple of minutes now?
That was quick enough. We can go again.
What'd you say? Are you?
Yeah.
You can say. Okay. Do we have another question? One more question. I saw a lady in the back. Kathy, last question. Okay.
I'm just curious about
identify yourself, please.
Cecile Coors Lindell. I'm with TIG Advisors in New York. I'm just wondering about the process of the Media Bureau being able to stop a merger without actually having the entire commission weigh in. And if that's, you know, the shape of things to come, I guess. Is that?
Yeah, no comment from me on that one other than the statement I put out.
I guess I could just comment on the process. So of course, the Media Bureau has not formally stopped the merger. They've referred it to the administrative law judges. Now, whether this is taken as having a negative effect on the merger is a question where the form may deviate somewhat from the substance. On the other hand, referrals to the ALJs take place all the time within the commission, and this is not necessarily something where we want to draw in a commission vote on every one of them. So to the extent that this is potentially harmful to mergers and thus is a route around full commission process in the case where it might actually be a potential deal killer, that would be a reason for us to look at our internal processes. But as far as shape of things to come, I think it's very hard to make a call like that.
Okay, we're going to close, and as we do, I'll just say every time I am able to have the benefit of talking with these two commissioners, I learn something new. I always learn more than I thought I knew. So I thank you for that. Now just hold your applause because we're going to end the whole thing. I want to thank all of you for being here today. I think it's, at least in my view, it's been another terrific annual conference, and it wouldn't be as good as I think it is if we didn't actually have an audience here to participate and actually be here with us. So I appreciate that. I look forward to having our next event, and we'll have videos up by tomorrow evening of the whole thing. You can watch it one more time. But for now, thank you. And now let's all give a round of applause to our commissioners.